New York City, the Big Apple, the city that never sleeps. New York doesn't need much of an introduction. It is the largest city in the United States with an iconic skyline and many iconic buildings and sites. The population of its 5 boroughs is just above 8.3 million, but its broader metropolitan area has a population of over 22 million. Pertinent to our topic of sustainable cities is that New York is home to the United Nations headquarters. I am so excited for today's conversation because I get to talk to Penny Abeywardena, who I look up to and have for such a long time. She is New York City's Commissioner for International Affairs. Penny has been in this role for 6 years now, since 2014. When the Sustainable Development Goals were negotiated in 2015 at the UN nearby her office and officially launched in 2016, Penny knew immediately that the SDGs needed to be accessible for cities, and she knows that without a concerted effort by cities to align with Agenda 2030, the SDGs cannot be achieved in full. So she and her team came up with the Voluntary Local Review, and New York City was the first city in the world to complete a VLR in 2018 and followed that up with another one in 2019. Penny leads the global call for cities in all corners of the world to also commit to and carry out a voluntary local review. As Commissioner for International Affairs for the City of New York, what does your job entail?
It entails quite a variety of things. I will say the job that I started with back in 2014 has evolved pretty significantly over the last few years and has even evolved even more significantly since spring. So very quickly, New York City is host to the largest diplomatic corps in the world. We have the UN affiliates like UNICEF, 193 permanent missions, 116 consulates, which are very important bridges to our immigrant communities here in New York City and around the region. And then about over 70 international trade missions as well. So we have a very important responsibility. The agency is over 50 years really around the operational dynamic that the city has with this diplomatic corps. We work very closely with the U.S. mission to the UN and the Office of Foreign Missions to ensure that our diplomatic corps has what they need when it comes to everything from parking to security and navigating a complex city. But what I wanted to do is, and this is a vision that the mayor and I had when I was being interviewed, to be totally honest, and what we thought about this office is that New York City, under the de Blasio administration, is a progressive policy administration that believes that government should work for the people. And so we wanted to use what we were doing here in New York City as an example for how we can share best practices with other cities and states and really think about replicating ideas beyond borders. And so that's really, the kind of programming that we've launched under my tenure.
Yes, I've read that. You've accomplished quite a lot. And just as a side comment, as a young person, I'm especially impressed by all the outreach you do for education.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that, I remember my first conversation with the mayor is that we needed to make the diplomatic corps feel part of New York, but for New Yorkers to feel what this extraordinary value of having such a presence in its own city. And so I'll talk about it later, but in terms of the breadth of our programs, we really look at the heart of not only exchanging best practices on a expert level, agency to agency level, but also how does the everyday New Yorker benefit from this? And so our programming takes that into account very much, and engaging and enabling young people is at the heart of many of our strategies.
That's great to hear. And I know that many cities can look to you guys for inspiration or a roadmap of how to do it right. I love quotes. And I think a relevant one to our discussion is think global, act local. What does that mean to you?
That is that is a great quote and has been a guiding principle of my leadership here at the Mayor's Office for International Affairs. And I think a program that really hits that Think Global, Act Local is our New York City Junior Ambassador Program. So this was launched in 2015, soon after the global community came together and agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals. But what we decided to do was, one, there's different aspects to it. We wanted to ensure that New Yorkers and those that are most disadvantaged or underserved, so throughout our 5 boroughs, had a connection to the UN, and using the global goals as a language became very important. And we wanted to make sure that the diplomats felt connected to their city. So part of the program is to make sure that the diplomats are going to our schools, meeting our kids, talking about their country and their priorities at the UN. But fundamentally, the heart of the program, young people are learning about the Sustainable Development Goals, selecting one goal that is critical to that classroom that they agree to, or that school. And then they learn about how that is influenced by global movements, how it's working in sub-Saharan Africa, or how it's working in South Asia. And then what they have to do is learn about it in their own community. And at the end of the program, what they are asked to do is a commitment to action in their community.
New York is very unique in that it's the largest city in the US, and also, as you mentioned several times, has UN headquarters. And we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. But if we could take a step back, how did the Sustainable Development Goals come into being at the UN? Sort of, when did they come onto the stage?
Nope, that is a great question. It's been in the work for quite a few years. So the SDGs were really born at the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, which happened in Rio in 2012. Prior to that, I'm sure many of your listeners might remember the Millennium Development Goals, which started in 2000 to really tackle addressing poverty, and they had quite a few achievements. But really what the global community wanted to do was come together around how they can, in addition to addressing the inequality, what the urgent environmental, political, and economic challenges that were facing our world, right? And in this new space of technological advancements, et cetera. So it came together at a conference in Rio, but really the most powerful moment, and I had the honor of being there, was in 2015 during the UN General Assembly. Everybody was here. The Pope was here. I think the Pope was here. I'm trying to remember if it was 2015 or 2016. I have now been in my role for over 6 years. So we've had some highlights, the Pope coming to New York City and to the UN General Assembly. All to say, when the global community agreed to it, it was really extraordinary. It's just this common framework and language where we agree to what priorities are, but then we have, this ability to connect around policy and action in a way that's just, unprecedented. So it's been very exciting.
And yeah, the Sustainable Development Goals are really exciting, as you mentioned, because it gives people from all over the world, governments from all over the world, a common language, regardless of what certain priorities may be in their country. And we keep repeating the goals were negotiated at the UN, mm-hmm. which is a convening of national governments. Mm-hmm. And obviously I'm speaking to you in local government of New York City, and I'm especially excited to talk to you because you are the inventor of the Voluntary Local Review. Actually, let me back up for a second. As we said, the Sustainable Development Goals are for national governments. They were designed for national governments. So national governments measure them through a mechanism called the Voluntary National Review. Yeah. Right, so we should give that background. Again, you're the inventor of the Voluntary Local Review. New York City was the first one to go through the process and publish it. And the Voluntary Local Review is a way for cities to measure the Sustainable Development Goals at the local level and what makes sense for their city. So I'd love to ask you, what was the inspiration behind the Voluntary Local Review?
The Voluntary Local Review was a very natural step in the development of the way that New York City was relating to localizing the Sustainable Development Goals. So very quickly, back in 2015, when the SDGs were agreed to, my team mapped what we were doing in New York City. So we have a One NYC development agenda, and this was very important to the mayor and the entire administration, in that we rebuild post Superstorm Sandy and looking at resilience and sustainability, but with a strong equity lens. And that strong equity lens really led for us to have synergies with all of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we did was we first launched what's called the Global Vision Urban Action Program. It was an opportunity to bring together New York City experts around issues of sanitation or gender equity and bring in other experts and diplomats that are based here in New York City into the conversation so that we can start using this platform to share best practices so that we could start accelerating impact on the ground and recognizing that local leadership, right? There's not any other level of government that is more reactive and connected to the people, right? So the Voluntary National Review and the national governments working on the SDGs is absolutely critical. You need buy-in on every level, especially on issues like climate, right? But at the end of the day, it is the behavior of local policy that is also going to be critical for the furthering of the SDGs and the global goals. This is not an exercise in undermining or usurping sovereignty of member states. This is the recognition that along with civil society, private sector, local governments are as important to achieving the SDGs than any of these others, these other partners. And so we got that support and we submitted our very first one in 2018.
So I'm curious, when you went through the VLR journey for the first time, what was it like for New York City to localize each SDG? Because again, these are global goals.
Yeah. And it's not, so the VLR, and so the VLR is a product that, where we reflect on the SDGs and what we have achieved and then share that output with the UN, right? Through this voluntary local review. And we talk about what's working and what's not working, because it's important for people to see. I want Paris and Nairobi to review the VLR, say, hey, we actually have a really good idea for that. What's not working for you, so let's connect on that. This is where it's a real process, because when we launched our Global Vision Urban Action in 2015, I spent a lot of time talking to other commissioners and agency heads about why it did matter for them to assign somebody senior on their team, to talk to somebody on my team around what the sustainable development goals were, what the specific goal was related to transportation, sanitation, whatever the topic. And for these agencies, these very localized agencies, to appreciate the importance of this global framework. Right. And so there was a lot of relationship building where we had to do, you had to bring people along. I'm talking about the SDGs like I was born with it, but this is what my job is, right? There are people that, are in the field every day in their topic and are not thinking about it through this lens. And so there is quite a lot of work that you have to do just to make your colleagues that are so localized thinking in this global framework. And it's important that you don't just do it with other city colleagues, you have to do it with the community, right? And that's why the Junior Ambassador Program is really important, because now you suddenly have kids that are going home and talking about the global goals and why climate action is so important, to their parents who may work in a bodega. And I think that, to me, is at the heart of like how you make this into a community activation. And so that was the work that we had been doing since 2015. So we had 3 years that by the time the voluntary local review idea came up, we were working closely with our team that was leading on One NYC and holding agencies accountable for the goals identified in One NYC. So part of our development agenda that was very important to the administration is that we're not just saying this is what we're doing, we're holding ourselves accountable and then sharing that information transparently with you every year in terms of how we're achieving it. And so that partnership with our One NYC team and the work that we were doing with the SDGs is really what translated into a VLR. And this is sort of the role that we are playing with other cities now, is for them to understand it sounds overwhelming, but it's really what you're doing. It's just using a different lens for thinking about it. And I think that's that distinction that is important, without people sort of throwing up their arms and saying it's too much work. It's not. You're already doing it. You just got to think about it a little bit different.
That's a great way to put it, especially with even big cities who might have smaller departments of international affairs, or smaller cities who just overall don't have as much staff. They might just be like, we already are overwhelmed with so many things. Why do we need to add this to our plate? And you already talked about this a little bit, but if you could dive into a little bit more detail about how you mobilize your own team, but also external stakeholders, and how long does a VLR typically take you guys?
It takes a couple of months to actually get the final product together, and we have committed to submitting one every year. Obviously, things are different now. So, New York City was the epicenter of the pandemic this spring, early summer, and we are now in phase 4, thank God. And, things are looking strong in terms of our indicators and holding COVID here. And, one of the things that has been really interesting has been the desire. I wasn't sure what was going to happen with the VLR and this localizing the SDGs, with every city and state around the country, around the world, overwhelmed, drinking out of a fire hose, dealing with not only COVID-19, an economic crisis, civil unrest like we haven't seen in decades. And so it's like social unrest, and it's, there's so much going on, but this is an opportunity for us to recalibrate a new normal that is just better, healthier, more fair for everyone. And what has been very interesting is seeing the role that the VLR is playing. So we have over 200 local governments from around the world that have now committed to our declaration on the VLR. And what we have noticed is that COVID-19 and this extraordinary moment that we're in right now has increased the desire for cities and local governments to want to come together in a cohesive way that is tangible around addressing the issues that are impacting our community. I'm still surprised at how much trouble there is in communicating the importance of this. They're like, it's too wonky, it's too this, and it's like, no, it actually isn't. If you just stop for a second and pay attention to what the ask of the SDGs are. And what I said earlier, it's like any local government that at the town level, city level, village level, you hope that whatever the leadership is doing, it is to improve the safety, the health, the economic opportunities, the education opportunities of that community, right? That's why taking what you do and thinking about it through this global framework is really not as complicated, because ideally you're trying to move forward those agendas if you're a good leader.
You did mention already you have more than 200 cities that have committed to conducting voluntary local reviews. That's amazing. And I have two sort of related questions. One, for cities who are listening out there, or young people who think that their cities should do a voluntary local review, how can they get started? How can they maybe connect to you and learn how they can make it work for their city? And then secondly, so, we have these over 200 commitments, but we don't have 200 voluntary local reviews that have been published, right? So from your conversations or experience, what is holding back the cities that have committed and have not yet completed, besides COVID, of course?
Yeah. No, and so to answer your last question first, we actually, so the way that New York City did our voluntary local review, and obviously we made this up to a certain extent, and so there is a moment of iterating and improving that we're just all going to participate in. It was really important that we kept the barrier for entry low. We did not, one of the things that I was worried about is people are like, sure, New York City should do it. They're big and they host the UN, so it's natural. That is something that we wanted to get away from and say, actually, we're doing this because there is value when we are, as cities and local governments, being transparent and using this common language and framework, and then being able to exchange best practices, my whole spiel there. What we knew, though, is that every context, every region, every size of a city is going to have different political, community level challenges and opportunities. And so what we needed to do is create a mechanism where cities and local governments of all sizes can fit within a spectrum of engagement, right? The most engaged are those that are already thinking about the SDGs and were able to submit, or are able to submit a VLR to the UN. But we didn't want to dismiss everybody else that was on that spectrum. So we created this New York City declaration for the voluntary local review, explicitly to say, here are the 3 things that we're going to ask for you. Please map what you're doing to the SDGs. If that's too overwhelming, choose 1 or 2 that's core to your priorities, right? Maybe it's education and transportation. Maybe it's gender equity and climate change. Choose whatever you feel comfortable with. And again, some people are like, that's not perfect. We have to start somewhere. And to me, getting them even comfortable, the city comfortable with thinking about 1 or 2 SDGs in the way that we're working and the way that they're working, that's extraordinary. So do that mapping. Once you do that mapping, you have to engage stakeholders. That's not only your community, those are colleagues without through city government, but how are you engaging? Who can essentially be partners? Perhaps you identify the private sector in your community as an important stakeholder, engage them, and go through this process, and then we'll end up with a voluntary local review. And so my staff provides that support, but we've also partnered with, and this this is where, we're a tiny staff, but we punch above our weight based on the partnerships that we have. UN DESA, UN Habitat, Brookings Institute, the UN Foundation. There are a number of institutes, the World Economic Forum, that have committed their platform, that have committed their time to creating handbooks, providing resources that are helping these cities. We have, our first city that signed on after New York City was Helsinki, an important Northern European, well-funded city. And, at the other end, we have cities around the global south that have different challenges related to how their national government might flex, on their city power. And so it has just been a really interesting way of approaching this, because we really do want this to be global. We want this to be Orlando, Florida, but we also need this to be Kazan, Russia too. And to me, it's having that diversity that makes it challenging in terms of just having a set silver bullet, but has been also very the foundation of how we have shown up to ensure that the barrier of entry is low, that we have created avenues for resources and support that different cities are going to need. And obviously, COVID has, made creating the VLR, I think, more difficult, but it's actually heightened the interest in participating in this process, right? Because it's not just a report. It's not like a one-time product. It is a process. It is something that is iterative, that ideally connects you better to your community, identifying those issues that is important to your community, and then building that bridge with your global counterparts to get the best ideas that then accelerate the impact in the community. It's like a full circle right there.
And just to circle back and follow up again, let's say Austin, Texas, or Kigali, Rwanda would like to make a commitment if they haven't already, and learn how to get started. How can they do that?
They should reach out to my office. Our website is fully updated with all this. If you just Google the Mayor's Office for International Affairs in New York City, there's an entire VLR section. You can see the language that we're asking. You can see reports that have been submitted, so you can start to get a sense. But there is a email address. We have an entire team that's working on it that you can do outreach to. Also, we are very proactive about this. So, with the mayor, we are sending out invitations to mayors around the world to participate in this. So we are doing proactive recruitment, and then I'd love joining podcasts like this, but other opportunities and events to talk about the voluntary local review, not just for the sake of just the SDGs, but this is a very important time for local leadership and power to be highlighted, because what COVID has done is just sort of draw, whatever that saying is. Sorry, I'm an immigrant kid, so I always get these like things where I draw back the curtains or whatever. But we are seeing how inequity and racial injustice is resulting out of COVID-19. Unfortunately, we got hit really hard, mostly in our Black and Brown communities in terms of deaths, right? Who are essential employees, who were in neighborhoods that are underserved. And so that, to me, has been a priority over the last couple of months, is to continue to push the VLR and the localizing of the SDGs, to say that this is, there's not a time than now where city and local leadership is more important than ever.
Yes, and thank you so much for your proactive leadership and continuing to have so much energy in pushing this message out there. And I promise you, there's a lot of young people out there who are behind you and want to lift up what you're doing and spread the word. So we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. We need it.
And I'm also so excited that you touched on a bit ago about how you do have so much support in New York City, which I'm so glad to hear. Like UN DESA, UN Foundation, Brookings is really giving their time and resources as well to support this initiative through reports and other documents that can help
And
cities.
tools and resources. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I'm going to say it again, we have 10 years, and these next few years are going to be especially important to get cities engaged and start, if they haven't already, start thinking about the SDGs, localizing them and measuring them so they can assess, okay, where are we now? So we can get more aligned or achieve these goals by 2030. As you said, it's such an amazing tool to build back better, and especially build back with more equity. With equity, some places need to start there in the first place. And one part of equity I'd love to talk to you about is gender. Of course, there is a specific goal within the SDGs, which is number 5, gender equality. And 2020 is an interesting year as well because it marks 25 years since the Beijing Declaration. And we've talked about why cities are vital to achieving the SDGs beyond their one SDG 11, right? They should pay attention to all 17. And so similar, why do you think gender equality is important to the achievement of the overall SDG agenda?
Because we're half, if not more, than the world's population, and everything we do matters. Full stop. Direct quote. No, I think it's so important that there is the SDG 5 that really brings out the importance of gender equity and access. But I think everybody that works in any issue around the policies related to the SDGs recognizes that gender is at the heart of how they have to approach that, right? Whether it's climate change, it is just thinking about how half the population is impacted by these issues, how they are having access to opportunities based on these issues, ensuring that gender equity, even if it's just who's on our panel at an event, I'm aware of that. I'm like, sorry, this is not going to work if it's going to be me, with 5 other men. That's not. And to me, I think it is that boldness in which this administration, with the way that I run this agency, how we continue to ensure that the gender equity is pulled out in these conversations is just, it needs to be deliberate. It needs to be something that we are always thinking about as we're tackling these different policy issues.
Thanks for talking about gender with me. And, 2 last questions.
Sure.
I've hammered this a million times, but I don't think it's ever enough that 2020 means we have 10 years left, which is the decade of action, as we all call it, to achieve Agenda 2030. And it's no secret that globally we're behind in achieving Agenda 2030. So how can cities specifically step up to accelerate the achievement, and what obstacles are cities facing and effectively contributing?
Yeah, I mean, when that was originally, brought up as the decade of action and how we thought about moving forward, entering this decade, we didn't anticipate what COVID-19 would do, especially in terms of the impact in our communities and the economic crisis and everything that has been happening. So if anything, what COVID has done again is reinforce the importance of local leadership. I think the VLR and the work that New York City and our partners are doing to better engage cities and local leaders on these SDGs has been critical, but there's a lot of movement that's happening around, C40 and what they're doing around climate action. I mean, there are some really important coalitions and collectives like UCLG and the Global Task Force that bring together cities. We've been organized and we've been doing the work that we've been doing. It feels like other institutions and places of power are recognizing that we need to be at the table more consistently, strategically, and brought in as a partner much earlier on. So, I feel very good that cities will have an important voice in the next decade in terms of how we achieve this. I think what has yet to be seen is what the impact of what COVID-19 is going to do to cities, very directly in terms of the morale, the mental health of our communities, the economic crisis, how families, I mean, New York City, after, surviving being the epicenter of the pandemic here in the US, we have 4 priorities in this administration right now. And they include making sure people have enough to eat, a roof over their head, access to safety and healthcare. It is, to a certain extent, we're back to the basics. And when you are back to the basics, you can also, again, reshift dynamics and processes and structural inequities to come out of this with a better new normal.
Yes, and I agree with you that we can't just look to get back to where we were, because where we were was not so perfect.
No, it was not.
And I want to end by highlighting young leaders. I have 2 questions about young people in their local communities. I'll start with one. What is your advice to young people on taking action in their local community to make it more sustainable? How can they be proactive?
I think, and honestly, if you guys want to check out our junior ambassador page, I mean, it's for younger kids, but you can see there is a lot to be said about if you are excited on issues related to gender equity or climate and knowing what those issues are, but really looking around your community and seeing what organizations are working on and figuring out how to volunteer, get involved, support those efforts. There's a lot more need right now, more than we needed 6 or 8 months ago, for young people to start showing up and supporting in different ways, right? So something that could seem small, but like visiting a nursing home and, helping to take care of people that, just with time and company, is actually a really important SDG around mental health. And to me, it's just thinking about what you can do and not needing to go do the biggest, most exciting thing, because we are limited to our communities and our neighborhoods right now. It's about the kind of action that you can have. All these other issues didn't stop. Climate change is still an issue. Everything is still an issue. And so figuring out what you can do in your community, on your block, is extraordinary to me, I think.
That's such a good point about how we literally can't leave our communities right now.
Yeah. So how can you improve your community? And again, as we've talked about over the last hour, how bridging that to the international and the global framework and all of the social media platforms then allow you to connect. I mean, between, all of the different ways to connect with other activists around the world, it's an extraordinary time kind of to be stuck at home and have this opportunity to make change in your neighborhood, but be part of this larger collective. It's pretty awesome.
Absolutely. And my last question, thanks for hanging in there with me.
My pleasure.
Also about young people. What is your call to action to both local and federal governments, if you want, to meaningfully engage young people, let's say under 30, to assist them as a partner in achieving the SDGs?
That is, listen, governments are going to have to get really creative about everything that they do in all levels of government in the coming months and years. I could only sort of influence what's happening here in New York City, but I do know that at every level of government, they have to think and should be thinking about how to bring all of you in as sort of the change makers, quite honest, not only preparing you for the future, it's the reality that you can make a difference right now, and we need your help.
Thank you so much. And hopefully everyone who's listening can read more about New York City's SDG Ambassadors Program, and hopefully cities can replicate something like that, or use it as inspiration to create an initiative for their young people to directly engage with the SDGs.
Amen.
So thank you so much for your time and insight and inspiration to us all.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on the launch of your new podcast.